When the envelope was opened, the room held its breath in an odd way, like a tide stilled by some invisible reef. People moved and spoke around me in the ritual ways funerals require, but my attention had folded inward to a very small, heavy thing, a lockbox key in my palm and a sentence in the will that named me the one who must open what my mother had hidden. The lawyer read the formal lines about property and small accounts, and then a single instruction that was not legalese, but a request written in the uneven hand my mother used in lists and grocery notes. It told me where something lay and asked me to finish what she could not. My sister's face across the room had been white and hard for hours. Earlier on the drive there, she had said something that I had dismissed as grief-stricken caution. Now her warning tasted like prophecy. The key was cool in my pocket. The word finish pulsed under my skin. Whatever else the will could be, it was now also a map to something my mother had tried to protect. I would not know then that opening that attic box would not only expose theft, but would drag me into a public, ugly unbinding of a community I had always thought I knew. My name is Savannah Carter. I grew up in a house that smelled of lemon oil and old books, in a town where civic pride read like etiquette and every neighbor had a name that sounded like an address. My mother was a woman who moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to getting things done. She hosted luncheons, steered boards, and accepted civic medals with a contained grace that made people assume the family's generosity was a simple, natural thing. My father left when I was 12, and over the years his absence settled into a rumor that no one discussed. My mother turned that absence into purpose. She learned to manage appearances and does favors in the name of the town. She also learned how to quiet questions with charm and with the subtle displacement of attention. Lydia, my sister, learned other rules. She learned to smile in photographs, to offer the correct sentence at the right time, to protect the household's reputation like an heirloom. I learned to step back where the conversation turned toward money or politics. I studied art, I moved away for periods of time, and I saw the world from the outside enough to know our town's kindness had edges. I loved my mother and guarded myself against being swallowed by the shape of her life. When she died, I expected sadness and the ordinary legal tedium that follows a funeral. I expected neighbors to say the right words and for the town to continue. The will opened a different door. My mother had left me a small metal box and a key and had asked me to look inside the attic. The box was heavy with folders and with things that smelled like paper and old ink and the faint smoke of late-night detectives. It contained deeds, canceled checks, bank statements with names I did not recognize, photos of our home taken with someone else's vigilance. My mother had not been hoarding. She'd been collecting proof. At first, I told myself the practice was petty, an interpersonal grievance made legal. Then I found a deed to the lake property transferred under my aunt's name. The signatures and notarizations were there, as neat as a perfunctory blessing. The transfer date was years earlier, and the payments recorded did not match what our family's records reflected. As I lifted one paper after another, the house of our family's story wavered. The neat explanation my mother had offered for years, that paperwork was routine and neighbors generous, started to look like a scaffold hiding the theft of value built on our labor. My mother had been fighting quietly for decades. Lydia had been right, she had known more than she let on. She had whispered that our mother was hiding something, but she had not given reasons because caution had taught her silence. Now the silence she wore looked less like grief and more like the heavy patience of someone who had been waiting for a moment when truth could be wielded rather than whispered. Evidence stacks like confession. The patterns were sober and precise, wires moving through shell accounts, transfers routed through states where corporate names were cheap and anonymous, deeds executed and reconveyed with notaries who crossed ceremonial lines. The names that kept returning were familiar in the small town sense. They were people who cut ribbons at public openings and sat on the committees that blessed community projects. One of those recurring names belonged to my aunt, a woman who had once embraced our mother on stage and who had accepted plaques at the same ceremonies. The documents traced value to accounts that disappeared like footprints at high tide. I started to talk to people I had known in other contexts. An old contractor I had helped when he volunteered at his school fair admitted, with a shameful look and a hand covering his mouth, that he had processed payments he did not question because everyone else acted as if the transactions were ordinary. A bank clerk I barely knew explained how certain transfers had been coded as gifts to obscure the origin. The deeper I dug, the louder the instances of complicity became recognizable. The notary who had signed too quickly under pressure, The city official who had been politely persuaded to ignore small irregularities, the friend who had accepted a little advantage and then looked away. For every person I found willing to answer, there were two who refused. Anonymous calls warned me off. My mother's attorney said the woman had been methodical and terrified. She had worked quietly with a journalist and a lawyer to compile an archive that would not simply accuse but demonstrate what had been taken. The metal box had been an offering arranged with care, a baton passed to someone who would do more than mourn. My mother had asked me to finish what she had started, an instruction that read like a request and a direction she had not felt able to complete. When some of the documents reached a reporter, the town tightened in reaction. People prefer tidy narratives, and a tidy town is not pleased to find itself messy. The watchdog group we connected with pushed for an inquiry. What started as a whisper became a hearing, interviews, subpoena requests, and an unraveling. My aunt's presence in documents shifted public perception as stories coalesced into legal questions. For my part, I felt like someone who had just become literate in a language of money and paper, learning to translate bank jargon into accusations of theft and fraud. Then came the break-in. The house felt violated in a new way. The metal box had been rifled through, letters scattered. One item, a note my mother had left addressed to me, had been taken. Someone had wanted to make it look like a random theft, but the choice of items removed indicated a pattern. They had taken the piece that would shame us into silence. Instead, the community that had once applauded my mother began to murmur and then to act. People who had been privately uneasy about the arrangements offered statements. The very neighbors who had once sent polite cards started to provide bank records and notarized affidavits. The theft meant that fear had awakened others to the risk of remaining silent. With more papers and eyewitnesses, the pattern hardened to a case. The board meetings shifted tone. The county opened inquiries. Local officials who had once been helpful acted as if they had been misled. The investigation moved sluggishly and then with an unstoppable gravity. My mother had chosen the right moment to pass the baton. The public hearing was crowded in a way small courthouses are when they know something in their bones is about to change. Cameras leaned forward like curious necks. My aunt sat with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to public favor. When the investigator presented the evidence in the sequential terms a court requires, the air stopped sounding like polite civic life and started to sound like law. Charts showed transfers, emails linked accounts, notaries admitted procedures that should not have been performed. Men who had once spoken at ribbon cuttings stepped forward with documents whose edges showed fingerprints and hesitation. One by one, the pieces fell into place. A contractor confirmed how certain projects had been billed, and the invoices did not match the actual work. A city official admitted to having looked away when a small donation was relabeled. The notary confessed to signing without proper verification. The documents, once assembled, created a narrative that was not accusatory rumor but a ledger of theft. The prosecutor used language that did not aim to wound but to correct. Fraud, forgery, and conspiracy were not abstract words they could say casually. They translated into the simple fact that we had been stripped of property and reputation. When I testified, I was careful and human. I spoke about my father not as a myth but as a man who had been pressured and then gradually edged out. I spoke about my mother's quiet work and the nights she had compiled evidence while everyone else slept. I laid photographs on the table showing our house recorded by someone else and letters promising things that had not been delivered. The room listened. Lydia, who had once practiced the right smile, read statements that finally had a witness's weight behind them. Our story was no longer a rumor but a record. The turning point came when bank records tied a string of transfers to shell companies that had been used to pay off people who could alter records. The connections were clear. The judge read preliminary findings that ordered restitution and returned deeds. The press named the files in the town that had once praised. Our family now read headlines that complicated the narrative. The man who had been the face of civic duty in so many photos was revealed to be part of a scheme that had benefited a circle that included my aunt. Victory was not clean or joyful. The house of relatives around our table lost its easy fellowship. People who had been part of celebrations were now defendants and estranged canonical faces. There were legal appeals and anxious nights. There was the cost of watching neighbors close down like bookstores at dusk, but the deeds returned. The lake property was restored to our name. Restitution was ordered. My father's reputation, bent by rumor, was legally corrected. It was a kind of repair that did not erase what had been taken, but acknowledged that taking had been wrong. The judge's gavel did not mend all wounds, and the files did not bring back certain dinners or whispered childhood certainties. They did, however, erect a public record that held power accountable. For the first time in decades, there was a ledger that matched the truth. In the months that followed, the house wore a new kind of quiet. The lake property became a place to teach children how to fish, and a scholarship fund in my mother's name began awarding modest grants to local students, a project she would have preferred be practical rather than showy. Lydia and I reorganized holiday dinners into smaller, honest gatherings where speech was not perfumed with obligation. My aunt did not attend a single one. She had been convicted and erased from the public rituals we once performed together. The foundation we started in my mother's name focused on municipal transparency and educating people about how easy it is to confuse generosity and theft. We supported local efforts to require public bidding and to train notaries in proper protocols. The notary who had admitted errors now worked with a board dedicated to ethical practice. Our community changed slowly. Small meetings became more earnest. People who had once clapped now asked for receipts. There were nights when gratitude was thin and the cost of truth palpable. Other nights I watched Lydia teach a class on civic participation and felt the kind of quiet pride that does not need public applause. There were mothers who thanked us for restoring a fairness that had been stolen. There were men who admitted to small compromises and tried to fix them. My mother's metal box sits in the study. Sometimes I open it and touch the edges of the notes she left, the handwriting that told me to finish the story. I think of her patience and the price she paid in private. I think of the time she called a friend in Manai and asked if a deed might be misplaced. I think of the way she saved small evidences like someone collecting the last raindrops after a storm. If there is an instruction in all of this, it is not a call to vengeance, but to vigilance. Families become histories, and histories can be rewritten by a few people with access to ledgers. Keeping watch is boring and slow and often thankless. But in the end, it matters. The small acts of keeping journals, filing papers, and storing receipts are the scaffolding of truth. I finished the story my mother asked me to finish. I paid a cost in lost easy friendship and in the strange loneliness that justice sometimes leaves behind. I also restored a name and a home. Sometimes I think of the laugh I had the day my sister warned me and how small it felt in retrospect. The key in my hand had been a responsibility, an inheritance of labor and pain. The metal box had been heavy, but the work of opening it turned out to be heavier and truer. Years later, children run beneath the oak at the lake, and my father's name appears in quieter company, cleared in the public record and in the hearts of those who now understand a little more about what can be hidden by paper and applause. The house smells like lemon oil and old books again, only now it smells like truth.